He was one day away from losing everything, until his horse started digging at the frozen ground and uncovered a secret that changed it all. The wind over northern Montana carried no mercy that winter. Eli Mercer, a worn-out rancher with debts older than his boots, had already said goodbye to hope. But when his loyal horse began pawing at a corner of frozen earth, the sound echoed like a heartbeat from the past. And what they unearthed would turn his last defeat into a story no one would forget. The morning light in northern Montana came in thin and pewter, the kind that made a man think of winter before it arrived. Eli Mercer set the chipped mug near the edge of the kitchen table and smoothed the paper beneath his palm. "Final notice," the letters said, calm as a judge. The farmhouse ticked and settled around him, slow as an old clock. Through the window, the barley stubble lay flat under a skin of frost, and beyond the corral rail, Remy stood still with his head turned toward the north fence, listening to a wind that hadn't started yet. He read the letter again because there wasn't anything else to do. Past due balance, fees, foreclosure. The words carried the chill of bank glass and carpeted offices, of voices that said "sir" without meaning respect. The line about surrendering the deed went through him like a cold nail. Somebody at the mortgage lender had even typed a friendly sentence about options. "You may consult an attorney." The word looked heavy on the page, like a piece of iron laid down and left to rust. He thought of the last time he'd sat across from an attorney after the accident on the rig, and how the man had smelled like cologne and certainty. Eli had walked out with a settlement and a silence that never cleared. Steam curled off the coffee and drifted away as if it too was leaving. He took a sip, set the mug down, and forced himself to breathe deep. The room held the smells he knew by heart: old pine floor, saddle soap, a hint of last night's wood smoke. The stove door clicked as the fire fell in on itself. From the porch came a soft scrape, the mail basket sliding when the breeze nudged it, and then the small house went quiet again, the way it did when the day waited for a decision. He stood and shrugged into his coat. The sleeve lining caught on a scar at his wrist. He eased it free and stepped outside. Frost crisped under his boots. The sky to the east was a low blue blade, the sun notched somewhere behind it. Remy lifted his head as Eli crossed the yard. The Mustang's breath came in little white flags and drifted off downwind. "Morning, old boy," Eli said. His voice sounded like gravel, used hard and put away wet. Remy flicked one ear, then returned to that same fixed posture toward the north. That had started a few nights back. No spook, no fuss. Just that attention, taut as a rope, drawn between the horse and a point on the ground. Eli latched the gate and slid a hand along Remy's neck. The coat was warm and dusty, the warmth that lingers after a body has done a day's work. "We've got Friday," he said. It wasn't much of a prayer. The bank woman, Nora Hale, had been decent enough last time, decent in the way folks are when they can't do a thing to help you. She'd told him to bring in his home insurance papers, his property tax receipts, anything that might buy time. He had stacked them into a manila folder as if paper could hold back a winter. Across the pasture, the old windmill crouched like a crane with its head tucked down. It hadn't turned since September. He walked the fence line out of habit, pliers hanging from his back pocket, though he didn't fix what cattle wouldn't test. The staples were proud in places, the wire slack. Sagebrush carried that clean, bitter scent that rides just beneath the wind in this country. A diesel rumble rolled far off on the county road, then faded. Somewhere a hawk threw its shadow, and a rabbit went to ground. The usual. The small, faithful noises of a world that didn't know a man could lose everything by noon on a weekday. When he came back to the yard, Remy was at the north rail with one front hoof half raised. The horse let it fall in a short, precise stroke. Thock. Eli stopped. The sound was dull and hollow, not the dry tip-tap of frozen dirt. He waited. Remy lifted the hoof again, placed it down as if measuring, and gave another thock, then stood with the weight slanted toward that corner. "Cut it out," Eli said, gentle, because the horse had saved him once before on a winter road when the pickup started to slide. The Mustang had leaned his shoulder into the trailer like a man shoving a door shut against a gale. Some animals keep a ledger on you, he'd always thought. They remember what you owe. He climbed the top rail and hung there, looking. The ground beyond the corral flattened into a strip of brittle grass and shale, then dipped toward a shallow swale where cottonwoods used to drink. His grandfather had called that patch the Bad Bend. In the right thaw, the top crust sank and took your boot heel with it. In summer, the place smelled a little like iron after rain. Eli frowned. There wasn't any iron to smell in November. A slow truck turned into his drive and worked up the ruts. He knew the shape of it even before the sun flashed across the windshield. Bank truck. White, clean hubcaps. Tires that had never seen the far pasture. He swung down and met it halfway with his hat brim low. Nora Hale stepped out, her coat buttoned to the throat, hair caught back in a no-nonsense knot. She wasn't one for makeup. The wind had done enough to her face that paint would be an insult. She glanced at the corral, at the yard, at the house that leaned a little when the weather went hard. "Morning, Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice held that county office steadiness people trust, until the numbers stopped making sense. "I wish I had better timing." "You and me both," he said. They stood with their breath showing between them like two small trains idling on the same track. Nora opened a folder. "I drove out because phones don't say things right. We're at the end of our extensions. Friday is—" She stopped and found the exact word. "Final." He nodded. He had known the word already. "I've got the home insurance up to date," he said. "Taxes, too. Just no cash to bridge. I can put in for a refinance, but you and I both know the rate they'll hand a man like me." He almost said personal loan and credit card, those old mirages that look like water until you step into them. He'd cut both to the bone after the rig accident. Debt didn't care what a man had survived. Nora studied his face the way people do when they're deciding whether to offer hope or spare a man the insult. "Bring what you have anyway," she said, and there was kindness in it, not the false kind. "I'll walk it through. Can't promise a thing, but I'll try." He started to thank her, but her eye caught on Remy, who had raised his hoof again and let it fall once more. Thock. It carried across the yard with a queer, empty quality, like someone knocking from the wrong side of a door. "What's he doing?" she asked. "Listening for something I can't hear," Eli said. Remy lowered his head and pressed his nose toward that north corner, not sniffing. Pointing. If a horse had a finger, that's where it would be. Nora closed the folder. "My dad ran sheep," she said, almost smiling. "He'd tell me when an animal does a thing twice the same way, you listen a third time." She slid the folder back under her arm. "I'll see you in town, Mr. Mercer." He watched her truck rattle down the lane and float away on a cloud of road dust. Then he looked back at Remy. The Mustang stared at the ground and drew a breath that lifted his ribcage and sent steam past Eli's knuckles. Without thinking why, Eli fetched the short-handled spade from the barn wall. He didn't plan to dig. Not really. He just carried it because a tool steadies a man who has nothing to fix. He climbed into the corral and walked to the corner. The soil there had a hard crust to it, like bread left 3 days too long. He pressed his boot heel against it and felt the thin top skin give. Beneath, the dirt was darker. He crouched and put his palm down flat. Cold. Then, under the cold, a suggestion of something else, a whisper of cool rising, as if the ground had a breath. He held it there until his skin went numb, and the numbness passed, the way it does if you wait. "Remy," he said, hearing how small the word was in the open. The horse lowered his head until whiskers brushed Eli's sleeve. He did not paw. He did not move. He only waited with the sort of patience that makes time honest. Eli lifted the spade and set the tip against the crust. He meant to push once, just to prove the foolishness of it and go back inside to the letter and the coffee, that had gone from lukewarm to cold. He leaned his weight, and the blade broke the surface with a sound like a jar opening after years in a cellar. A smell came up, faint, metallic, not the sour bite of swamp, but something older. Deeper. He knew the smell before his mind consented to name it. He'd lived long enough to recognize trouble even when it came dressed as luck. He sank the spade again and turned a small square. The dirt clung like damp flour. "That's enough," he told himself. And it wasn't. He set the spade a third time and heard the edge scrape metal. The sound shivered up the handle into his bones. Remy let out a breath that might have been a sigh and might have been a warning. Eli cleared the square with his fingers until they stung in the frost. Beneath the thin layer of earth, something circular showed through, iron-stained, red-brown and pitted, the rim of it feathered with shale. An old cap. He could picture his grandfather's hands setting that steel 40, 50 years back, working by lantern, telling nobody because the world had different rules then. He pressed his thumb against the rust and felt it give a little. The cold came through and settled in his wrist. He sat back on his heels and looked at the farmhouse, the road, the sky that hadn't made up its mind. The paper on the kitchen table was waiting to be what it was. The bank would do what banks do. He could drive to town with his folder of papers and his best face and see if mercy lived behind glass. Or he could stay right here with a spade and a horse and a circle of rust that smelled like memory and risk, like old engines, like nights he had sworn to forget. Remy shifted his weight and touched Eli's shoulder with the flat of his muzzle. The gesture was quiet, almost formal, the way two men might set their hats before a job that could kill or save them. "All right," Eli said, and the word came out on a cloud he could see and almost touch. "If you've got something to show me, we'll see it together." The night came down over the valley like a slow bruise. The last of the light turned the fields the color of ash, and the frost crept out of the low swales to coat the fence line. Eli left the porch lamp burning. Inside, the clock ticked with the slow insistence of something keeping score. He'd told himself the cap in the dirt was nothing, scrap metal, maybe a well casing from his grandfather's day, but he hadn't stopped thinking about it since sunset. Remy moved in the corral, a pale shadow against the darker dark. Eli could hear the steady rhythm of the horse's breathing. He poured a finger of whiskey into his coffee mug, not for comfort, but for the small fire it brought to the chest. The cup warmed his hands while the wind tried the windows. He thought about calling Nora Hale, asking what the bank did with land that might have undocumented assets, but the thought made him laugh without sound. Banks didn't call it an asset until they owned it. When he stepped back outside, the cold hit him square, biting the skin under his collar. The stars were hard and sharp, and the moon hung low enough to taste of metal. Remy had moved again. Same spot. North corner. His head lifted. Ears pricked. Then came the sound. Low but sure. Thock. Thock. The hoof falling on the frozen earth with the measured patience of someone testing a door. Eli stood at the fence and let the sound roll through him. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, the way a heartbeat has a reason behind it. He pushed the gate latch with his thumb and stepped into the corral. Remy turned slightly, not alarmed, not welcoming, just aware. Eli laid his hand on the horse's shoulder, felt the muscle quiver under the hair. "You got my attention," he said softly. The horse blew a breath that misted between them, smelling of hay and cold iron. "Now what are you after?" He crouched again where he had dug that afternoon. The frost had settled into the cut, making the dirt edges sparkle under moonlight. He pressed his palm flat and felt that same faint exhale from the ground, a whisper of air neither warm nor cold, just moving. He lifted the shovel and pushed once more, widening the edge, careful not to make noise that would carry. The blade caught on something again. A scrape, dull and close. Eli knelt, brushed aside loose dirt. Beneath the first ring of rusted metal, a second surface glinted back, smooth as glass. He squinted, wiped the frost with his glove. It wasn't glass, but enamel, the kind used on old well caps decades ago. His grandfather had told stories of men hunting for oil out here before the big fields moved east, drilling shallow, plugging the holes when the price dropped. "They said the ground here sighed at night," the old man had laughed once. "Never knew if it was ghosts or gas." Eli set the shovel aside. The thought should have made him smile, but instead it sat in his chest, heavy. He remembered the blowout on the offshore rig, the roar that sounded like the whole ocean inhaling before it spat fire. He remembered the men who hadn't come home. The smell of crude had followed him for weeks after, soaked into his skin no matter how hard he scrubbed. That was the year his wife, Caroline, had stopped opening the windows when he came in. She'd said the smell made her sick. Maybe it wasn't the smell. He rubbed the side of his jaw, cold scraping against stubble. He'd buried enough of that life. He didn't need to dig it back up. Yet here he was, kneeling over a scar in the dirt, drawn by a horse that refused to leave it alone. A gust of wind slid over the land, carrying the faint aroma of shale and something else, something chemical and sweet. He frowned, bent lower. The smell thickened where the soil was disturbed. He scraped a little more with his fingers, and the earth turned darker, tacky even in the freeze. A thin sheen spread across his glove. He brought it to his nose. The scent was unmistakable. Oil, heavy and old, the sort that bled slow. He sat back hard. The cold went straight through his jeans, but he barely felt it. "You've got to be kidding me," he whispered. The words puffed in the air, turned to nothing. Remy stamped once, as if in answer. Eli let out a short breath that sounded too much like a laugh. "You're smarter than the rest of us, aren't you?" The horse lowered his head and blew across Eli's shoulder, the breath warm even through the coat. For a long minute, neither moved. The sky above them turned deeper, almost violet at the edges. Somewhere down the road, a coyote called and was answered. The noise made the night feel wider. He rose and walked back to the house, boots ringing on frozen ground. Inside, he lit the old kerosene lamp and stood over the sink, staring at his glove. The faint black smear across the leather caught the light. He took a rag and wiped it once, twice, but the sheen stayed, thin as shadow. He laid the glove down and washed his hands. The smell clung. He thought about what that patch of ground could mean. It wasn't a fortune. Nobody struck it rich off half a barrel's seep in the 21st century. But if there was a capped well, it might mean mineral rights, royalties, leverage with the bank. He could stall foreclosure, maybe pay the tax. Or maybe it would just mean lawyers and surveyors and another kind of ruin. Oil brought wolves faster than blood did. He poured himself another coffee and stared out the window. Remy had moved away from the hole now, standing mid-corral, head low, calm again. The horse had done his part. Whatever came next belonged to the man who still had to face Friday. Eli leaned his forehead against the glass. The frost outlined the shape of his breath until it disappeared. "I'm not ready for this," he said quietly. The words felt like confession. Out there, the land didn't answer. Only the faintest echo reached him. The slow, hollow thock of a hoof on frozen ground, patient as time. He stayed by the window until the lamp burned low. When he finally went to bed, the scent of crude still clung to the room. It reminded him of things that had nearly killed him once and might yet save him now. He dreamed of dark waves under his feet, of a horse standing in the middle of them, steady as rock. By dawn, a fine mist of snow had fallen, barely enough to hide the shovel marks. He stepped onto the porch and watched Remy nose through the frost near that same corner, leaving a pattern of hoof prints that looked, for all the world, like punctuation marks written by the land itself. The next afternoon came dry and brittle, the kind of cold that cut sound in half. Eli had been mending the back gate, trying not to think about the dark stain beneath the frost up north, when he heard the hum of a truck long before he saw it. A sleek silver pickup rolled through the lane like a thing that didn't belong to dirt roads. The tires barely touched. Through dust. When the door opened, a man stepped out wearing a city coat that looked like it had never known mud. "Mr. Mercer?" the stranger called, smiling wide enough for both of them. "Name's Vince Harlan. I represent an energy group out of Denver. We're scouting opportunities for renewable development in this area. Wind, maybe solar. Thought I'd drop by and see if you're interested in turning this place into something that pays you back." Eli rested the pliers in his pocket, wiped his hands on his jeans. "You folks pay for wind now?" Vince laughed. "In a way, yes. Clean energy's the future, Mr. Mercer. We offer solid leases, tax incentives, guaranteed income. Beats gambling on barley in a drought." The words slid smooth as oil. He took a slow look around. The empty pastures, the barn leaning with its years, the horse watching from the corral. "You've got the kind of property we look for. Elevation, exposure, privacy." "Privacy's the one thing I've got left," Eli said. Vince's grin didn't waver. "Then maybe it's time to cash in while you can. The bank's breathing down a lot of folks' necks these days. Hard times. But I can make that go away. Quick sale, no press, just signatures and relief. You'd walk away debt-free." He said it like a gospel promise. Eli studied the man's shoes, black, sharp, dustless, and thought about the cap buried in the field. "Funny timing," he said. Haven't seen you types up here in years. Why now? Vince tilted his head, eyes narrowing just enough to notice that he'd been read. Opportunity, Mr. Mercer. There's federal money for this kind of project. Everyone wins. Behind them, Remy lifted his head, ears flicking. The horse gave a short, hard stamp against the frozen earth. One note, clear as a knock on wood. Vince flinched slightly. Eli almost smiled. I appreciate the offer, he said. But I'm not looking to sell. The salesman's face held its shape, but the warmth drained out. At least think on it. You've got, what, a week before the bank steps in? After that, you'll be negotiating with strangers instead of neighbors. I already am, Eli said. Vince's jaw tightened. All right then. He reached into his coat, pulled out a polished business card. If you change your mind, call me. Don't wait too long. Opportunities have a way of drying up. He laid the card on the top rail of the fence, as though setting a wager, then walked back to his truck. The engine started with a purr too smooth for the Montana cold. As he drove away, the sun caught the chrome bumper, throwing a bright spear of light across the yard. Eli picked up the card and turned it over in his glove. No address, just a phone number and the words, Harlan Energy Consultants. He slipped it into his pocket and looked toward the north pasture. Remy was standing there again, neck stretched toward that same corner, tail twitching, the horse's hide caught the last light, shining copper beneath the dust. Eli could feel a pressure behind his ribs, something between curiosity and dread. Inside the house, he set the card on the table next to the letter from the bank. Two promises, side by side. One slow, one fast, both with teeth. He brewed coffee thick enough to stand a spoon in and sat there until the stove cooled. When darkness came, he went back out to the corral. The wind had gone thin and cold, whispering through the cracks in the barn siding. Remy moved to meet him, quiet except for the creak of leather straps. Eli leaned on the top rail, eyes fixed on the patch of ground beyond. He'll be back, he said. The horse shifted, breath clouding the air. He thought about the salesman's words. Quick sale, no press, relief, and the way his smile had trembled when the horse stamped. Men like that didn't drive hours down gravel roads for clean energy. They came for what lay underneath. Maybe Vince didn't know exactly where, but he knew enough. Eli pushed off the rail and walked the line of fence toward the north, counting his steps. When he reached the place where the frost broke darker, he crouched. The wind carried the faintest tang of oil again, sharper now that the air was dry. He ran his hand through the topsoil, felt it crumble between his fingers, slicker than dust had any right to be. He straightened and looked back at the house, small and alone against the rising moon. For a moment, he imagined Caroline standing in the doorway again, hair catching the lamplight, telling him not to chase ghosts. Then she was gone, like breath on cold glass. Remy snorted softly, bringing him back. The horse's ears twitched toward the county road, where the faint red tail lights of the stranger's truck were just fading into distance. Eli spoke without thinking. You heard what he said, boy. He'll be back. The words hung there, carried by the same wind that had always taken everything from this land. Topsoil, rain, voices. He rubbed the horse's muzzle. Next time he comes, we'll be ready. Remy lifted his head high and let out a low, rolling whinny that drifted down the valley, a sound so full and sure that even the wind seemed to listen. Inside, The coffee had gone cold again. Eli left it untouched. He took the business card from the table, tore it once down the middle, and dropped the pieces into the stove fire. The paper curled and blackened, sparks chasing each other up the flue. He watched until the last one winked out. When he went to bed, the smell of smoke and oil lay together in the air, uneasy companions. The old cap in the ground waited under its skin of frost. Somewhere beyond the hill, a truck engine shifted gears and kept moving. And in the corral, Remy pawed the frozen earth 3 times before settling into stillness, as if to mark the end of a promise no man should have trusted. The 3rd night after Vince Harlan's visit, the wind died without warning. No slow taper, no sigh through the sage. Just silence, thick and total. Eli had never known the High Line to go still like that. Even in winter, the air usually prowled the fences, carrying dust, the scent of diesel or wet hay. But that night it stopped dead, as if the world had taken one long breath and forgotten to let it out. He sat in the kitchen with the stove burning low, boots on, coat still buttoned. The lamp's yellow light drew small circles on the table. Outside, the dark pressed against the windows like an animal wanting in. The silence was so deep, he could hear his own heartbeat. Remy moved once in the corral. He could tell by the faint creak of boards. And then nothing. Eli tried to read the mail he hadn't opened, a thin stack of advertisements and bills. One of them was a glossy flyer from the gas station in Havre. Propane delivery special. Mortgage refinancing options. Online trading made simple. Words that sounded like they belonged to some other life, some other century. He pushed the pile away. The smell of crude still lived in his gloves, a ghost that soap couldn't touch. He poured a little water into the percolator, set it on the stove, and listened to the metal tick as it warmed. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and stopped. That was when Remy screamed. It wasn't fear. It was alarm, sharp and slicing, the sound that cuts bone deep before the mind knows what it means. Eli grabbed the lantern, yanked on his hat, and stepped into the night. The cold struck him full in the face. The air held that strange stillness right before snow, though no clouds showed overhead. The lantern flame trembled but didn't lean. Remy stood at the far corner of the corral, ears pinned forward, hoof raised. "Easy, boy," Eli called, voice low. The Mustang struck the ground once, thock, and the sound came back hollow, too hollow for frozen dirt. Eli climbed through the rails, boots crunching in the crust. The smell hit him halfway across the yard. Faint, metallic, a trace of oil mingled with frost. He knelt by the spot Remy had marked. The earth was fractured now, a jagged crack running from the post outward, like lightning frozen in clay. He brushed it with his glove. The ground gave slightly, the top crust floating over something softer below. He set the lantern down. Light pooled across the break, catching on a rim of rusted iron, the same cap he'd uncovered days earlier. Only now it looked different, edges cleaner, a circle widening on its own. Beneath it, dark soil gleamed, damp even in the freeze. Eli touched it. The dirt clung to his glove, slick and faintly warm. "What the hell?" he murmured. Remy snorted and stepped closer, hooves sinking half an inch. Eli dug with his bare hands, pulling loose clods. A faint hiss escaped, not air but gas, thin as a whisper. Then came that smell again, richer this time, unmistakable. crude. He leaned back on his heels, breathing hard. The lantern light painted his face amber. The oil shimmered faintly where it seeped from the crack, black glass against pale ground. He felt dizzy, not from the fumes, but from recognition. Every nerve remembered the roar of the rig, the way flame rolled over steel, the moment the platform dropped beneath his boots, and the sea caught him. He'd sworn he'd never smell this again. Yet here it was, waiting in his own backyard. Remy lowered his head and breathed over Eli's shoulder, the way horses do to steady the herd. The sound was steady, calm. Eli lifted one gloved hand and let it rest on the animal's cheek. "Easy now. We're not lighting any fires." He forced a laugh that didn't quite make it out. He fetched an old shovel from the barn, careful not to clank metal on metal. The lantern threw long shadows across the boards. The air inside smelled of leather, dry feed, and something sweeter. The apple he'd left on the rail that morning, half eaten by birds. He carried the shovel back and began to clear more earth, widening the hole until the cap was fully exposed. It was embossed faintly with numbers and letters worn down by time. MAR, 1952. The rest had rusted away, but it was enough. His grandfather's mark. A memory rose, his grandfather telling him once, "The ground, here's got a secret, Eli. It keeps it well." The old man had laughed then, like it was just a story told to a boy too curious for his own good. Now that laugh felt like prophecy. He pried gently with the shovel edge. The cap shifted with a tired groan. More gas slipped out, the scent thicker, raw. He stopped, set the shovel aside. Every instinct from the old life whispered caution. If the line beneath still held pressure, one spark could finish what the sea had failed to do years ago. He stood there, breathing through his scarf, waiting for the ground to settle. When it did, he took a step back, planted the shovel upright like a flag, and looked up at the sky. The moon hung bright and unsympathetic. All around, the land was silent, but for the faint click of cooling metal. Eli turned toward the house, meaning to fetch a tarp to cover the hole. Halfway there, the stillness broke. A low hum came on the wind, the first wind in hours, rolling from the east like a sigh. It carried the dry rustle of tumbleweed and the ghost of Vince Harlan's engine miles away. He paused at the porch, watching dust lift off the road, curling into the night. He thought of calling the sheriff, maybe even the state geologist's office. But the thought dissolved before it formed. The minute a man like him reported oil, it wouldn't belong to him anymore. Papers would come, then trucks, then men with clipboards and gloves whiter than snow. The bank would fold his land into a file marked asset. His grandfather's name would vanish under signatures. He went inside, set the lantern on the counter, and stared at the dirt on his hands. Tiny black streaks ran through the creases, catching the lamplight. He scrubbed until his skin reddened, but the smell held. It sank deep, familiar and foreign all at once. He leaned against the sink, eyes on the dark window, where his reflection stared back with an exhaustion that looked permanent. Behind him, the stove ticked. The fire had sunk low. He added a log, listened to it catch, then walked back to the door. Out in the corral, Remy still stood guard over the broken ground, head high, tail lifted by the returning breeze. Eli whispered, "We found something, didn't we? God help us, we really did." The wind picked up, rattling the eaves for the first time in days. It wasn't a clean wind anymore. It carried the scent of oil, sharp and sweet, threading through the cold. Eli stepped onto the porch and let it wash over him. Somewhere, far off, thunder rolled where no storm should be. The land was waking up, and he wasn't sure it would let him sleep again. By morning, the thaw came early. Thin light spread across the valley, turning the fields the color of old brass. Eli hadn't slept. He'd sat through the long night watching the flame in the stove shift from orange to blue, hearing the wind rise again. Every time he closed his eyes, the smell of oil came back, thick and clinging, the ghost of his old life that refused to die. He went out before sunrise. The frost had melted around the corner of the corral, leaving a dark patch of mud that looked almost wet. Remy waited there, head lowered, tail flicking slow. Eli crouched beside the crack in the ground. The iron cap glistened faintly beneath a thin layer of moisture, the color of burnt honey. He could smell it even before he saw it. Crude, heavy, the same kind of oil that had built and broken half the country. He touched the edge of the cap with his glove and drew back quick. The metal was warm, impossibly warm, as if the earth beneath still carried a pulse. He straightened, heart knocking hard against his ribs. He could almost hear the voices from those years offshore, the laughter before the blowout, the screams after. The memory came uninvited, sharp as a flare. The rig shaking, his friend Luke shouting for the shutoff, the deck buckling under heat. Then the cold slam of water, salt burning his eyes. He had lived when better men hadn't. That guilt had clung to him longer than any smell. Eli wiped his hand down his coat and forced the past back where it belonged. "It's different now," he muttered. But even saying it made his throat tighten. Remy pressed his nose to Eli's shoulder and stood that way, solid as a wall. The contact steadied him. For a minute, he let himself breathe in time with the horse's slow rhythm, the sound of life refusing to quit. By noon, the sky turned gray, promising snow. He went to the barn for a bucket and a short-handled crowbar he hadn't used in years. The air inside smelled of rope, dust, and sweet hay. As he passed the stall, he caught sight of the old photograph pinned to the beam. Caroline, standing barefoot by the creek, wind in her hair. She had hated his work on the rigs, hated the danger. "One day," she'd said, "the oil's going to come for you, Eli. When it does, don't let it take more than it has to." He left the photo where it was and carried the tools outside. The ground by the cap had softened. He knelt and wedged the crowbar beneath the rim, feeling for the weak spot. The metal moaned low but held. He pressed harder. A hairline seam cracked open, and a breath of gas slipped out, faint but distinct. The smell filled his chest. Earth, rust, crude, all woven together. He covered it again quick, pressing the mud back with his palms. The last thing he wanted was to start a story that ended with headlines and sirens. Remy shifted behind him, uneasy. Eli turned, half smiling. "You're right. I should leave it." He pushed the shovel into the ground nearby to mark the spot, then sat back on his heels. "But it's there, boy. real as daylight. From the ridge, the wind carried a truck's distant growl. He watched the dust plume snake along the county road, too far to tell whose truck it was. Instinct told him it wasn't the mailman. He waited until the sound faded before standing. His hands shook from cold and nerves. He wiped them on his jeans, leaving black streaks that glimmered in the weak light. Back in the house, he washed up at the sink. The water ran brown, then pink, then clear, but the stain stayed in the lines of his skin. He leaned on the counter, letting the faucet run, and caught his reflection in the window. Older, hollower, eyes darker than he remembered. The man staring back looked like someone halfway between ruin and discovery. He turned off the tap and went to the small room where he kept his papers. In the bottom drawer lay the lease from his grandfather's day, yellowed and fragile. At the bottom, under the description of acres and boundaries, a line read, "Mineral rights retained by owner." He hadn't noticed that line in years. Now it gleamed like a buried key. He folded the paper and slid it into his coat pocket. When he stepped outside, snow had begun to fall, light as ash. Remy stood facing the north again, mane lifting in the first gust. Eli followed his gaze to the dark patch at the fence. The falling flakes hissed when they touched the oil film, melting before they landed. He felt something move deep inside. Fear or faith, he couldn't tell. "All right," he said softly. "If the land's talking, I'm listening." That evening, as the storm rolled in, he lit the lamp early. The flames swayed in the draft, throwing shadows across the walls. The bank's letter still lay on the table. He unfolded it, read the words again. Final notice. Payment due Friday, the day after tomorrow. He could see his choices narrowing like the road in a blizzard. Sell to the bank, sell to the slick man from Denver, or take a gamble on the secret under his boots. He reached for the phone, dialed the operator, asked for an old number he hadn't used in a decade. The voice that answered was rough with age. "Doc Redford," it said. "Doc, it's Eli Mercer. I think I found something on my land. Thought you might want to take a look." There was a pause, a cough. "Found something or made something?" "Didn't make it. Just uncovered it. Old well, maybe capped. It's bleeding again." Another pause. Then, "I'll come tomorrow morning. Don't touch a damn thing till I get there." Eli promised he wouldn't. After he hung up, he sat by the fire, watching snow trace slow patterns across the window. The world outside had gone white, but the thought of that black sheen beneath the soil burned bright in his mind. Before turning in, he walked to the door and looked out one more time. The storm muffled everything, but he could still see Remy's outline through the drift, standing watch, head high, facing the north. Eli whispered, "Keep an eye on it for me, partner." The horse stamped once, sending up a small puff of snow, and turned back toward the corral's dark corner. The sound was muffled but sure. Thock, thock, thock. Like the heart of the land beating slow and steady under the frozen earth. The storm eased by morning, leaving a thin crust of ice on the troughs and a hush that stretched for miles. The hills looked washed clean, white over gray, the kind of light that flattens everything and hides depth. Eli poured feed for Remy and watched the horse chew slow, steam rising from his nostrils like the first smoke from a chimney. There was a calm that didn't feel safe, the kind that comes before bad news. By midday, a trail of tire marks cut fresh through the snow. The tread was deep, too wide for a ranch truck. He followed it with his eyes until it disappeared behind the cottonwoods at the ridge. Whoever had come, they hadn't stayed long. He felt that familiar tighten in his gut, a sense learned from years offshore when the sea shifted just before a storm. He shut the gate and went inside. The phone rang once, twice, then a third time. He picked up. "Doc Redford," the voice said, steady as always. "Road's half closed, but I'm coming. Don't do anything stupid till I get there." Eli smiled despite himself. "Wouldn't dream of it." Doc arrived just after dark, headlights carving through the mist. He climbed out stiffly, his parka zipped to the chin. "Christ, Mercer," he said, eyeing the dark stain near the corral. "You didn't exaggerate." He squatted, sniffed the air, touched the edge of the soil with a gloved hand. "Crude, heavy grade, probably capped back in the 50s. Nobody drills this shallow anymore." Eli crouched beside him. "So it's real?" Doc glanced up, his eyes sharp under the hood. "Real enough to bring trouble. You keep this quiet?" "So far." "Good. Keep it that way." Doc straightened, joints popping. "Oil like this, word gets out, and the whole county'll come. Knocking. You need to test it right, but not tonight. Let the frost set. Tomorrow we'll pull a core sample." Eli nodded. The wind picked up again, carrying a faint moan through the cottonwoods. Doc turned his collar up. "You hear that?" "Been hearing it for days," Eli said. "That's not wind, son. That's pressure. She's moving under there." Doc kicked at the snow, uneasy. "Let it breathe too long and she'll bring friends." They walked back to the house, boots crunching on ice. Inside, Eli poured coffee thick enough to chew. Doc sat at the table, rubbing warmth into his hands. "You remember what I told you when you left the rigs?" he asked. "Stay away from fire and lawyers." Doc chuckled. "Still good advice." His eyes softened. "This place was your granddad's pride. He capped that well himself when prices tanked. Said he'd rather let the land sleep than sell it to suits. You might think about doing the same." Eli looked toward the window where Remy stood motionless in the corral, a pale ghost in the lantern glow. "It's already awake," he said. Doc followed his gaze. "Then be careful what you promise it." The old man left before dawn. The snow creaked under his tires until the sound faded into distance. Eli sat by the window again, watching the sky lighten over the ridge. He told himself to rest, but rest wouldn't come. The wind had shifted south, carrying the faint drone of engines from far off, the low rhythmic growl of machines that didn't belong to ranch work. By afternoon, the tracks returned, newer this time, sharper. He stepped out with the rifle tucked under his arm. The sound of idling motors drifted closer, then stopped just beyond the hill. He waited. Nothing. Then, a crack of a branch, soft, deliberate. Remy threw his head, nostrils flaring. Eli whispered, "Easy." He slipped the safety off, the click loud in the still air. Another sound. A shovel? No. Metal on metal. Someone was tampering with the fence. He moved along the barn wall, careful not to crunch snow underfoot. The figures appeared in silhouette, 2, maybe 3, hunched against the cold. Their breath steamed in the lantern light they carried. One knelt by the corral's edge, digging fast. The other 2 scanned the yard. Eli raised the rifle, sighting low. He didn't need to shoot, just to remind them someone was home. "Get the hell off my property," he called. His voice cut clean through the dark. The nearest man froze. Another straightened and cursed. For a second, no one moved. Then Remy screamed, high and fierce, a sound that ripped through the stillness. The horse lunged forward, hooves striking the fence rail. The intruders bolted, stumbling through drifts, their lanterns swinging wild. Eli fired a single warning shot into the air. The echo rolled down the valley and died. When it was quiet again, the only thing moving was Remy, pacing the corral, muscles shining with sweat despite the cold. Eli went to him, laid a hand on his neck. "You're all right now. Easy." The horse shivered, then stilled. The smell of oil hung faint but steady, carried by the shifting wind. He checked the ground by the fence. The snow there was churned up, footprints deep, one of them leaving behind a scrap of dark fabric, denim, maybe, torn from a pant leg. He folded it, pocketed it. Whoever they were, they'd come for the same thing Vince had hinted at. Back inside, he set the rifle by the door. The coffee had gone cold again, a skin forming on top. He didn't bother reheating it. He just stood at the window, watching the horizon turn pale. His breath fogged the glass. "They'll be back," he said softly. Remy was still outside, standing in the same place as before, head tilted toward the north. The wind caught his mane and sent it streaming like black fire against the snow. The land felt alive again, but not gentle. Something old had been disturbed, and now the wolves, human or otherwise, had caught the scent. Eli leaned his forehead against the cold pane, the glass trembling faintly in the wind. "We'll hold them off, boy," he whispered, "whatever it takes." The lamp flickered once, then steadied, casting his shadow long across the floor. Outside, the wind answered with a hollow howl that carried through the valley, the sound of the world reminding him that nothing found ever stayed secret for long. Morning came thin and bitter, sunlight like dull steel on the snow. Eli hadn't slept. He'd kept the rifle near the door and the kettle on the stove, listening for engines that never came. The footprints near the fence had already filled with frost. By the time he stepped outside, they looked like old scars. Remy watched him from the corral, quiet but alert, head turning toward every small sound. At 8, the low growl of a pickup climbed up the drive. For an instant, Eli's hand went to the rifle. Then he saw the dented blue fender and the figure hunched behind the wheel, Doc Redford, wrapped in his old shearling coat, the same one he'd worn back when they both worked the rigs in North Dakota. The man moved slower now, but his eyes were still sharp as welding sparks. Doc stepped out, boots crunching the crust. "Morning," he said. "You look like you haven't slept since the Carter administration." "Couldn't," Eli said. "We had company last night." Doc frowned. "I figured as much. Found tracks on the county road. Big truck, mud tires. You tell anybody about that oil?" Eli shook his head. "Only you." Doc gave a short nod. "Then somebody's been talking out of school. Let's see what we've got." They walked to the north corner. The snow glittered underfoot. When they reached the patch, Doc crouched, pried loose the frozen crust with his pocket knife, and sniffed. "Heavy crude," he said. "Old, too. Damn thing's probably been bleeding through for years under this permafrost. You see that seam? Along the rim? That's pressure trying to breathe. You open it wrong, you'll have a gusher right through your barn." Eli folded his arms against the wind. "My granddad capped it, his marks on the iron." Doc looked up, surprised. "No kidding. Back in the 50s, everyone around here sold their rights to the big boys, except your grandfather. Man had guts." He pushed the dirt aside, found the faded embossing. MER, 1952. "Well, hell, you've got a legacy and a headache." He pulled a small glass vial from his coat, dipped the tip into the seep, capped it, and held it up to the light. "This'll tell us everything. Gravity, sulfur content, age. But I can already tell you, it's good stuff. Sweet crude. Folks will pay for that. Eli stared at the black smear glinting inside the vial. That's what I'm afraid of. Doc stood, his knees popping. I get it, but listen, if you don't claim it, somebody else will. You got mineral rights? Eli nodded. Found the paperwork last night. Says the family kept them. Doc grunted approval. Then you'd better file before the bank does. Harlan's people will move fast once they smell this. They headed back to the truck. The wind was picking up again, a low, steady moan through the grass. Doc opened his glove box, pulled out a folded map speckled with coffee rings. Here, he said, spreading it on the hood. County boundaries, well logs, survey points. Yours sits right over a dormant field, never produced more than a trickle. But a trickle's all a small outfit needs. Eli leaned closer. So it could work? Could and will, if you play it right. Doc jabbed a finger at the map. You file a claim at the courthouse. Then you lease the extraction rights, small scale. Keep control. Don't sell to the wolves. Not yet. Eli thought of the men at the fence, their boots sinking into his land. They won't wait for paperwork. Then get it done tomorrow. Doc folded the map. I'll test this sample tonight. Bring you the report in the morning. Don't let anyone else onto this property, you hear? Eli nodded, but doubt pressed hard. They already know I've got something. I can feel them out there. Doc gave a wry smile. That's oil for you. It draws men the way blood draws flies. He climbed into the cab and slammed the door. Keep your gun close and trust that horse. Animals see things first. Eli watched him drive off down the white road until the tail lights vanished into haze. Then he walked back to the corral. Remy met him halfway, breath smoking in the cold. You heard him, Eli said. Trust you more than lawyers. The horse nudged his shoulder, soft and insistent. All day he worked the chores half-minded, mending fence, chopping wood, anything to keep from staring north. But every so often, a shadow on the road caught his eye. A truck too far off to identify. A flash of glass on the ridge. He told himself, it was nerves. The land here played tricks when you watched it too long. At dusk, he went inside and checked the locks. The house smelled of coffee and kerosene. The file folder lay on the table beside the old map. He opened it again, tracing the faded words, mineral rights retained. Beneath it, his grandfather's signature curved like a question. The wind outside shifted, bringing with it the distant thrum of an engine. Remy nickered once, deep and low. Eli went to the window. Headlights crept along the far road, slow, deliberate, then turned off as if swallowed by the dusk. He waited, every muscle tight, but nothing followed, only the wind's long cry through the valley. He left the lamp burning through the night. Around midnight he heard Remy's hooves strike the ground 3 times, even. Steady. Not alarm, but warning. He loaded 2 shells into the rifle and sat by the window until gray light came. The snow outside lay untouched. The silence felt like a trap waiting to close. When dawn finally broke, he brewed coffee and stared across the frozen field. The hole near the corral had crusted over with ice again, a dark heart beneath white skin. He thought of Doc's words. File before the bank does. He imagined Nora Hale at her desk, her eyes soft but helpless, and Vince Harlan somewhere in his office polishing lies. Eli drained the cup set it down, and reached for his coat. "We'll settle this on paper," he told the empty room, "before they settle it in dirt." Outside, Remy turned toward him, ears forward, as if he understood. The wind swept across the yard, carrying a faint scent of oil mixed with snow. Eli pulled his hat low and started toward town, unaware that somewhere beyond the ridge, 2 black SUVs idled behind the tree line, their exhaust curling up like smoke from something already burning. The courthouse in Havre smelled of paper and rain. Eli stood at the clerk's counter with his hat in hand, boots dripping meltwater onto the linoleum. The young woman behind the glass took his forms, stamped them twice, and slid them back with a polite nod. "Filed and recorded," she said. "You'll get confirmation by mail within 2 weeks." Her voice had the clipped rhythm of someone who didn't realize she'd just changed a man's life. Outside, the snow had turned to sleet. Eli pulled his collar up and crossed to his truck. He sat a while before turning the key, watching the courthouse steps blur through the windshield. A thin ribbon of relief ran through him, but it was tied tight with worry. Filing meant protection, but it also meant record. The moment that stamp hit the page, the secret under his land became public knowledge. He started the engine and headed north. The radio gave nothing but static, so he turned it off and let the sound of the road fill the cab. Miles of frost-bitten fence lines rolled by, fence posts leaning like tired men. When he reached his gate, there was already a truck parked there, a black sedan with Denver plates, its engine idling low. Vince Harlan leaned against the door, hands in his pockets, looking like he'd been waiting for hours. Eli slowed, killed the engine, and stepped out. The wind shoved hard at his coat. "You must be lost," he said. Vince smiled the way a man does when he's already planned the conversation. "I never get lost, Mr. Mercer. I just take the long way when the view's good." He nodded toward the fields. "Looks like the snow treated you kindly." "What do you want?" "Straight to business. I like that." Vince walked a slow circle, boots crunching the ice. "We both know what's under this ground. You filed the mineral rights this morning. Smart move, by the way. I admire initiative, but paperwork doesn't keep wolves out forever." Eli didn't answer. The horse in the corral snorted, ears twitching toward the sound. Vince went on, voice soft. "Let's not play coy. My company has resources, equipment, permits, insurance, environmental clearance. You have, well, a shovel and a rifle. We can help you bring that oil up safe and clean. You'd get 20% of the first year's yield. That's a small fortune. Enough to pay your debts and retire." Eli's jaw worked. "And in exchange, I lose everything else." "You call it losing," Vince said. "I call it surviving." He took a folded contract from his coat, heavy paper with blue seals. "Sign this, and by next month you'll be out of debt, with a check big enough to start over anywhere you like. Montana's a hard place for old dreams." Eli looked past him to the corral. Remy stood motionless, tail flicking once, twice, the same rhythm as a heartbeat. "My dreams are right where I buried them," Eli said quietly. "And that's where they stay." Vince's smile thinned. He tucked the contract back into his pocket, then leaned closer, his breath clouding in the cold. "Be careful, Mercer. Oil makes enemies. Accidents happen. A spark, a break-in, a bad valve. Don't let pride write your obituary." Eli met his eyes. "You planning to light that spark yourself?" Vince chuckled. "Too quick. I'm just saying, some men die poor, some die proud. Up to you which one you want to be." He patted Eli's shoulder, turned to the car, and climbed in. "Friday's still your deadline with the bank. Think on it." The sedan rolled away, tires spitting gravel. Eli stood there until the taillights disappeared into the gray. The wind howled down the valley, carrying the faint smell of exhaust and crude. He walked to the corral, hand on the rail. Remy came forward, pressing his muzzle against Eli's chest. "That's their way, boy," Eli said, rubbing the horse's forehead. "Talk nice, then bite deep." The rest of the day passed without rhythm. Eli stacked wood, checked fences, anything to quiet the noise in his head. But dusk fell quick, bringing a strange tension with it. The air felt charged, heavy. The shadows stretched long across the pasture. Inside, the house flickered with lamplight and the steady tick of the clock. He sat by the window with the rifle leaning against the wall. The road stayed empty, but every gust of wind sounded like a motor turning over in the distance. He tried to read, couldn't. Tried to sleep, couldn't. Around midnight, the first noise came. A faint metallic clatter from outside, sharp enough to snap him upright. He grabbed the rifle and the lantern, stepped onto the porch. The night was dry. No wind now. The sound came again, near the barn. He moved slow, boots whispering on the snow. A shadow flickered between the fence posts. Then another. Two figures, dark against the dim light of the stars, moving toward the corral. One carried something long and thin, crowbar or pipe. Eli raised the rifle. "You're on the wrong property," he called. The men froze. For a heartbeat, everything held still. Then one bolted, the other following. Eli fired into the air, the crack echoing through the valley. Remy screamed, high and fierce, hooves striking wood as the intruders vanished into the tree line. Eli stood there breathing hard, the rifle still warm in his hands. The smell of burned powder mixed with the faint tang of oil from the frozen ground. He lowered the gun, staring into the dark. "You were right, Doc," he whispered. "The wolves always come." By dawn, the snow bore fresh tracks, big boots, running prints, one of them deep enough to catch water from the melt. Eli followed them to the road where they vanished into tire ruts. The wind covered the rest. He turned back toward the barn, where Remy watched him, muscles tense. "They'll be back," Eli said aloud, though no one was there to hear it. "But so will we." He brushed the horse's mane, the gesture slow and steady. A promise between two souls who understood the weight of silence. Inside, he poured the last of the coffee and looked again at the paperwork he'd filed. The stamp mark gleamed red in the gray light, proof that the land was his, at least on paper. But paper burned easy. The wolves out there didn't need permission. When the sun broke through, it lit the frost on the rails, turning the corral into a crown of glass. Remy shook his head, snorted once, and pawed the ground, 3 deliberate beats. Eli listened, recognizing the rhythm not as warning, but as vow. Whatever came next, they would stand together, man and horse, against the hunger of men who mistook greed for destiny. The night came thick and colorless, a sheet of cold draped over the valley. Eli had checked every lock twice, slid the rifle under the chair by the window, and left a single lantern glowing in the kitchen. Remy shifted in the corral outside, hooves crunching the frost. The horse's steady breathing was the only sound that kept the house from feeling abandoned. He poured himself coffee strong enough to sting the tongue and sat where he could see the yard. The wind had calmed, leaving the world too quiet. Each hour passed like a blade dragging slow through his nerves. When the clock struck 2, he finally closed his eyes, telling himself the worst had already come. That's when the bang hit, the sound of metal slamming wood. He was on his feet before thought caught up. Out the window, orange light flickered against the barn wall. "No," he said aloud, the word barely air. He grabbed the rifle and the lantern, shoved the door open, and stepped into the icy dark. The fire wasn't real yet. It was the start of one. Fuel cans tipped, rags soaked, the spark not caught. 2 figures ran toward the road, their boots drumming like panicked hearts. He raised the rifle, but didn't shoot. A bullet couldn't reach that kind of coward. He focused on what mattered. The barn door hung half open, fumes thick enough to make him gag. He grabbed a shovel and flipped the fuel cans upright, dirt smothering what little flame had caught. The smell of gas and oil hit him hard, raw, chemical, choking. He coughed until tears cut through the soot on his face. When it was done, he stood in the bitter wind, chest heaving, watching smoke curl upward but never catch light. The snow hissed softly as it melted under the black smear. Remy screamed, a sound more rage than fear. The horse's eyes caught the faint orange from the smoldering rags. Eli walked to the corral, dropped the shovel, and laid his head against Remy's neck. "You saved us again," he whispered. The animal's skin quivered under his hands, hot from adrenaline, heart thudding like a drum. He stayed there a long time, both of them steaming in the cold. When he finally straightened, his hands were shaking, not from chill, but from the realization of how close they'd come. A few more seconds, and the barn, the tools, the very boards under their boots would have been gone. He thought of his grandfather building this place board by board, of Caroline stringing lights for Christmas. The ghosts of those years crowded close, their warmth a memory that hurt to touch. At dawn, smoke still drifted in ribbons from the dirt. He filled the bucket, doused every patch until the hiss went quiet. The sun came up weak and pale, painting the land in bruised colors. Tracks led away from the yard, a single pair deep and straight, the same tread he'd seen near the fence before. Whoever had come meant more than mischief now. This was warning. He turned toward the horizon where the tracks vanished. For a second, he thought he saw motion, something black shifting against the white. But it was only heat haze from the exhaust rising off the road. Still, the unease stayed. Wolves didn't give up easy once they'd scented meat. Back inside, he stripped his coat, hung it by the stove, and sank into the chair. The air smelled of burnt oil and iron, the same smell that haunted every chapter of his life. He poured what was left of the coffee, thick as syrup, and tried to steady his breathing. When the phone rang, the sound made him flinch. "Mercer," said a voice he recognized. Nora Hale. "Are you all right? Sheriff Briggs stopped by the office. Said there was a report of shots fired out your way." Eli hesitated. "Just warning shots. Nobody hit." She exhaled. "He'll swing by this afternoon to take a statement." A pause, softer now. "Eli, I saw the claim you filed. Word's going around faster than you'd think. I can't stop what's coming, but I'd keep my doors locked if I were you." He looked out the window at the blackened snow. "They already came once," he said. "They'll come again." When she hung up, the silence folded back around him. He cleaned the rifle, oiled the barrel, checked the chamber twice. Then he stepped out to the corral again. Remy stood calm now, mane tangled with frost. Eli brushed it free. "They tried fire," he said. "Next time they'll try something colder." He set new locks on the barn, heavier ones, and hung a lantern above the door. The wind carried the faint hum of the highway, an endless, far-away murmur of lives untouched by his. He wondered how many people drove past this land every day, never knowing what slept under it. Maybe that was mercy. Some secrets weren't meant for daylight. Evening fell early. The sky turned the color of pewter, clouds building along the ridge. He made stew, ate little, and let the fire die slow. Outside, the lantern over the barn swayed with the wind, a tiny pulse of life in a sea of darkness. He thought about calling Doc, then decided against it. The old man couldn't fight shadows any better than he could. Sometime past midnight, he woke to a sound that wasn't a dream. Remy's hoofbeats, 3, slow, deliberate. He got up, looked out the window. The horse stood at the far edge of the corral, head high, ears locked on the road. No lights, no motion, just the kind of stillness that hides danger. Eli whispered, "I know, boy." He sat at the table with the rifle across his knees, the lamplight low. His eyes stayed on the road until dawn peeled the dark away. When the first light came, the snow around the barn had hardened into glassy crusts. He stepped outside, boots cracking through. The air bit sharp. He crouched where the fire had almost caught, dug his fingers into the soil. It was still warm underneath. Impossible, but true. He pulled his hand back, palm smeared with oil. He looked at it glistening in the morning light and whispered, "They tried to bury you again, but the land won't have it." Remy came up behind him, bumping his shoulder, gentle as always. Eli smiled faintly, wiping his hand on his jeans. "Guess neither will we." The dawn broke pale over the high line, the sun a weak coin in a sky scraped clean by wind. The snow had crusted hard through the night, glittering like shards of glass. Eli stepped from the porch, boots crunching, breath rising in slow ribbons. He had slept maybe an hour, if that, but the sleeplessness no longer felt like exhaustion. It felt like waiting. Something in the land itself seemed to hum under the frost, steady and sure. Doc Redford's truck appeared just as the light turned gold at the horizon. The old man climbed out stiffly, clutching a thermos in one hand, a folder in the other. "You look worse than I do," he said, "but you'll want to hear this." He laid the folder on the hood. "I ran the sample last night. That's oil, all right. High-grade paraffin base, worth more than most of what they're pulling from the Bakken now." Eli stared at the paper, numbers that didn't quite seem real. "So I'm sitting on something?" "Not something, everything," Doc said. "If you keep control, that well could keep you and half this county alive. But you'll have to fight to hold it." Eli closed the folder, eyes narrowing. "I already am." Doc nodded, glanced at the corral. Remy stood near the north fence, tail lashing slow, eyes sharp. "That horse hasn't blinked once since I pulled up. I'd say he knows more about this place than both of us." "He's been guarding it," Eli said. Doc blew on his coffee, watching the steam curl. "Then keep him close. Wolves move fast when they smell change." He reached into his pocket, handed Eli a card. "Lawyer in Great Falls, O'Reilly. Owes me a favor. He'll help you file the operating permit and mineral lease before anyone else can contest it." Eli took the card, turned it over between his fingers. The print was already smudging from his gloves. "I'll head there after lunch." "Do it today," Doc said. "Tomorrow you'll have company." The words hung in the cold air. Eli watched the old man's truck shrink down the road until it became a glint in the distance. Then he walked to the corral. Remy pressed close, snorting softly. "You heard him," Eli said. "Today." He saddled up, packed the papers in his coat, and rode out. The road into town cut through miles of open land, fences half buried in snow. The world smelled of sage and diesel, the wind sharp enough to sting. Each hoofbeat landed like punctuation against the silence. When the first rooftops appeared, he felt something loosen inside him. Hope. Fragile, but real. At the courthouse, Nora Hale waited near the steps, her hair whipped loose by the wind. She looked tired, eyes rimmed red. "I heard about last night," she said. "You all right?" "Still standing," Eli said. "Got a favor to ask." He handed her the papers. "I need these filed and notarized today." She flipped through them, scanning. "Mineral lease, operating rights? Eli, this means you're declaring open production. That'll go public record." "I know." "Then you'd better brace yourself. Men like Harlan don't take losing kindly." He met her gaze. "Neither do I." She hesitated, then signed where he pointed. "Good luck," she said softly. "And be careful who shakes your hand after this." He thanked her and rode back under a sky turning silver with afternoon. Halfway home, clouds gathered low, heavy with new snow. The wind rose, bringing the faint tang of oil again. By the time he reached his gate, the air smelled alive, charged. Vince Harlan's sedan waited by the porch, its black paint slick with melting frost. The man himself leaned against the rail, cigarette glowing in the gray. "You made your move," he said. "Smart, but not smart enough." "I'm not selling," Eli said. "Maybe not today." Vince dropped the cigarette, crushed it under his heel. "You think that paper gives you power? Paper burns. Wells leak. Men disappear." Eli stepped closer, eyes steady. "You had your chance, Harlan. Leave my land." Vince smiled without humor. "We'll see who the land belongs to when the lawyers come." He started for the car, then paused, glancing toward the corral where Remy stood. "Nice horse. Shame if he went missing." Eli's hand tightened on the rifle slung over his shoulder. "Try it." Vince's smile faltered. He got into the car, slammed the door, and drove off, wheels spinning on the icy road. Eli stood there until the sound faded, the cold biting his face. Then he looked toward the corral. Remy pawed the ground once, twice, 3 times, the rhythm that had begun all this. That night, the storm came hard. Snow hammered the roof. Wind clawed the eaves. Eli sat by the lamp with the rifle across his knees. Each gust sounded like voices whispering through the cracks. Remy's shadow moved beyond the frosted glass, a dark shape pacing slow and steady. Toward midnight, the wind shifted. The smell hit first. Oil, fresh and strong. He opened the door. The snow had drifted high around the corral, but from the hole near the north fence came a faint hiss, followed by a thin plume rising black against the white. The well was bleeding again. He ran to it, shovel in hand, clearing away ice. The ground trembled. Then, with a sound like a sigh, a dark ribbon of crude surfaced, thick and glossy under the lantern light. For a moment, all he could do was stare. The oil pooled, catching the glow, turning the snow to glass. It wasn't a gusher. It was quieter, like the land exhaling after holding its breath too long. He reached down, touched it with his fingertips. It was warm, alive. Remy moved beside him, breath steady. Eli turned, pressed his forehead to the horses, whispering, "We did it, old boy. The land spoke, and we listened." By morning, the storm was gone. The world lay bright and brittle, the pool frozen to a mirror. He filed Doc's report with the county that afternoon. By evening, the phone hadn't stopped ringing. Companies, reporters, neighbors he hadn't heard from in years. He ignored them all. When darkness came again, he stood at the corral one last time. The wind carried the faint scent of oil and sage, blending into something cleaner. The house behind him glowed soft through the window. He reached up, stroked Remy's mane. "It's ours now. Not for selling. Not for fame." The horse blew warm air against his cheek. Eli smiled. "We didn't find fortune, Remy. We found proof." He looked out over the land, snow, oil, sky, and for the first time in years, felt the weight in his chest ease. The ground beneath him was still scarred, but it was his. The wind moved again, low and constant, carrying the sound of hooves against frozen earth, a rhythm that felt like the heart of the world, beating slow and steady, refusing to quit. If you believe Remy was more than just a horse, drop a simple 1 in the comments. If you think it was just luck, type 0. Either way, I'd love to hear what you felt in this story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because the next story might just be the one that stays with you forever.